Montana, 1876. Sioux and Northern Cheyenne camped at the Little Bighorn River, under their chiefs Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall. For the US government, the American Plains Indians stood in the way of westward expansion. The Army's mission was to clear a path for the white man all the way to the Pacific. In June 1876, General George Armstrong Custer was ordered to drive the Sioux and Cheyenne into a government reservation. On the morning of the 25th of June, Custer's Crow Indian scouts reported an Indian village of 7,000. At least 2,000 of them were warriors. Custer had only 600 cavalrymen, but he was confident that the discipline and firepower of a modern army would outmatch mere savages. He sent 2 companies to scout the Indian position, one under Major Marcus Reno, the other under Captain Frederick Benteen. Crossing the Little Bighorn, Reno's column of 140 men was set upon by a bigger force of Indians, among them a young Cheyenne named
shots with my 6-shooter. I do not know whether any of my bullets did harm. I saw a Sioux put an arrow into the back of a soldier's head. Another arrow went into his shoulder. He tumbled from his horse to the ground.
Reno lost nearly half his men as they retreated in disorder across the river. The Indians moved downriver, hoping to cut him off. Custer was on a ridge high above the river, increasingly cut off from his 2 company commanders. Further upstream, Benteen's company was scouting for Indians. Seeing none, they made their way back towards the river. Benteen and Reno joined forces, but by now they had completely lost touch with Custer. Uncertain of Reno and Benteen's position, Custer decided to attack on his own. Chief Gall and his troops had been chasing Reno, but when they saw Custer attack, they changed direction. Custer scribbled a quick note and sent a messenger. Benteen, come on, big village. Be quick, bring packs. The ground was covered in sagebrush. It was easy for the Indians to take cover. Chief Gall sent for reinforcements led by Chief Crazy Horse. Custer realized how badly he was outnumbered too late. Benteen was not coming. He would have to go it alone. The cavalry dismounted and took up rifle positions. Indians attacked on horseback and on foot. Those on foot crept unseen towards Custer. Wooden Leg was among them.
The Indians all the time could see where were the soldiers, because the white men were mostly on a ridge and their horses were with them. But the soldiers could not see our warriors, as they had left their ponies and were crawling in the gullies through the sagebrush. In a few minutes, the warriors were all around these soldiers. Chief Lame White Man called out, "Come, we can kill all of them." Right away, all of the white men went crazy. Instead of shooting us, they turned their guns upon themselves. Almost before we could get to them, every one of them was dead. They killed themselves.
The Indians had won a battle, but they would not win the war. 1 year after Little Bighorn, the US Army destroyed Crazy Horse's village with 2 light cannons. Crazy Horse surrendered without a fight. On another continent, the British were facing the last resistance from native peoples in South Africa. There, the Zulus, under the warrior king Cetshwayo, mounted one last stand against the British. The Zulu tactic was to approach the enemy at a run, almost like a cavalry charge without horses. But when the Zulus hurled their spears at the British, the Zulus found themselves facing a gunpowder army. However, sometimes they won. In January 1879, 3 years after Little Bighorn, Cetshwayo launched a surprise attack at Isandlwana. 1,700 British soldiers were killed. Like Crazy Horse in America, Cetshwayo was doomed. 6 months later, he was defeated at Ulundi. For the British, it was the end of the black military threat in South Africa. After Ulundi, the British had nothing left to fear from the Zulu, but they faced a different tribal enemy, the white tribe of Africa, the Boers. The Boer War was fought between 1899 and 1902, and there were big stakes at risk for both sides. There were the diamond and gold mines of South Africa up for grabs, along with the country's commanding position of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The Boers were descendants of 17th century Dutch colonists. They were tough, individualistic people, as wary of the British as they were of the Africans. The Boers were farmers, and their home was the veldt, a vast expanse of grassland like the Asian steppe, extreme climate and difficult terrain. The Boers knew every inch of it. They were magnificent horsemen. And they had the latest long-range rifles. Man for man, the Boers were better marksmen than the British. On the 15th of December 1899, they clashed at the Battle of Colenso. The British suffered more than 1,000 casualties and lost 11 guns. Boer losses numbered 50. Using hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, the Boers won battle after battle, frustrating the British government who had promised a short war with troops home by Christmas. The British had 25,000 troops in South Africa, but eventually 500,000 British soldiers would fight there. The Boers never had more than 83,000 men available at any time. In November 1899, the Boers laid siege to the British garrison at Ladysmith. Over 4 months, 3,200 men died in its defense. But the tide turned in favor of the British. Money, sheer numbers, and the will to win at any cost brought victory in May 1902. The cost had been high. The death toll was 22,000 British soldiers against 4,000 Boers. But America and Britain didn't worry about the human cost of their 19th century wars. The Americans were in charge of their own destiny, and Britain controlled the richest empire in history. In February 1904, Japanese torpedo boats launched a surprise attack against Russia, wrecking almost half her fleet. There was no warning, no declaration of war, just a deliberate and devastating act of aggression. Newly modernized Japan was challenging European military supremacy. Port Arthur was Russia's only year-round ice-free port in the Far East. On the 8th of February, the Japanese laid siege to it. With Port Arthur blockaded, Russian naval reinforcements sailing from Europe would have no base. The next step in the Japanese war plan was to destroy the Russian army. The Japanese army of 283,000 men took on a Russian army of 4.5 million. They were outnumbered 15 to 1. Despite heavy losses, the Japanese kept up the siege of Port Arthur. The last stronghold fell on New Year's Day 1905, when 10,000 starving Russian troops surrendered. As the 20th century dawned, new weapons would be tested in the century's first conflict between two modern armies. One was long-range artillery, the other was the machine gun, which would become a vital part of infantry in 2 world wars. The Japanese fought fearlessly. They suffered 59,000 casualties at Port Arthur, compared with 31,000 Russians. However, Japan was a force to be reckoned with. The final battle in the Russo-Japanese War was Tsushima, fought on the 27th of May, 1905. It was the greatest naval battle of annihilation since Trafalgar, a century before. The Russians, under Admiral Rozhestvensky, brought their Baltic fleet to relieve Port Arthur. Japanese Admiral Togo lay in wait off the Korean coast near Busan. The Japanese ships were superior in speed and guns. After 2 days of fighting, 2/3 of the Russian fleet was sunk, and the 3 remaining ships were captured. Western journalists traveled halfway around the world to see the fight. But the most curious of all were the foreign generals who came to see the new war technology. Nine years after this picture was taken, these men would fight each other in the First World War. On the 21st of August 1914, 3 aeroplanes of the British Royal Flying Corps spotted German cavalry heading towards the Belgian mining town of Mons. The aeroplane was a new invention, but here, after only a week of war, the new machine had found a military role by spotting Germans where no Germans should have been, in neutral Belgium. The next day, the British responded. Horsemen of the 4th Dragoon Guards attacked German cuirassiers, killing several with their swords and pursuing the rest until they encountered a battalion of German riflemen on bicycles. The horsemen, once the elite force of the world's battlefields, were sent out to fight, but found themselves repelled by men in aeroplanes and on bicycles. This would be the first war of the machine age. The German troops at Mons hadn't strayed into neutral Belgium by accident. On that summer day, the Germans were advancing towards France in accordance with a carefully worked out strategy, the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan was aimed at Germany's 2 enemies, Russia and France, and it rested on 2 assumptions. Firstly, the Russians would need 6 weeks to put an army in the field. And secondly, 6 weeks was long enough to defeat France. The Germans decided that surprise was the key to deliver a knockout blow against France. The French would not be expecting an attack through neutral Belgium. With the plan set, the German army rolled into Belgium and prepared to invade France. With everything running to schedule, the German staff felt confident the war would be over by Christmas. However, they didn't realize that Field Marshal Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, had unwittingly moved his troops right into the path of the German First Army. The sun was shining that Sunday morning at Mons. The British outpost line was well hidden. It ran through the slag heaps of the coal mines and out along the canal. British troops were visible to the attacking Germans only at the exposed bridgeheads. It was here that the war would see one of its earliest acts of valor. Defending the most vulnerable of the Mons bridges was a section of the Royal Fusiliers under Lieutenant Maurice Dease. Keeping watch on the bridge itself was Private S.F. Godley.
During the time I was on the bridge, before the actual action started, a little boy and girl came up on the bridge and brought me some rolls and coffee.